A Don slapped Frank Lucas's package off the table. 48 hours later his family disappeared. November 3, 1969. 11:47 p.m. A private dining room on the second floor of Rao's restaurant in East Harlem. No music. No laughter. Just the sound of silver hitting porcelain and the low, deliberate voice of a man who had never in his life been told no. Don Carmine Galante sat at the head of the table with the patience of a man who had already decided how the evening would end. Around him, 6 soldiers. Not bodyguards. Not lieutenants. Soldiers. The kind of men whose hands had done things that courtrooms had never been allowed to hear. The kind of men who existed to remind the rest of the room that Carmine Galante did not negotiate. He announced. Frank Lucas sat across from him. 43 years old. Dark suit, no tie, shoes that cost more than most men in that room made in a month. He had driven himself. No driver, no security, no entourage. Just Frank Lucas, a leather satchel on the floor beside his chair, and the particular stillness of a man who had taught himself never to look impressed. The meeting had been called by Galante. That alone was significant. In 1969, Carmine Galante did not call meetings. Meetings came to him. The fact that he had summoned Frank Lucas to this table was, in the language of power, a message of its own. You are not yet above being summoned. Frank Lucas had come anyway. Not out of fear. Out of strategy. For 4 years, Lucas had been doing the unthinkable. A black man from rural North Carolina, no family connections, no inherited territory, no old-world bloodlines, had built the most sophisticated narcotics distribution network New York City had ever seen. He had gone to Southeast Asia himself. He had sat in jungles and negotiated with generals while the Vietnam War burned around him. He had found his own source, his own supply chain, his own smuggling routes. He had cut the Italian families out of the equation entirely, and in doing so had removed the single largest markup in the city's drug economy. Blue magic. 98% pure. Half the price of the garbage the mob was moving. The streets chose without being asked. By the fall of 1969, Frank Lucas controlled distribution across 5 boroughs. His product was moving faster than he could supply it. Harlem was his, but the thing about real power is that it never stops at the border you draw for it. It expands. And expansion, in New York, eventually meant touching territory that belonged to men like Carmine Galante. That was what this dinner was about. Galante had barely touched his food. He lifted his wine glass, looked at it rather than at Lucas, and began speaking in the measured cadence of a man reciting terms he considered final. Lucas would pay a 30% tax on every key moving through the Bronx and Queens. In exchange, Galante's people would look the other way. There would be no interference, no hijackings, no pressure on Lucas's street-level distributors. It was, Galante explained, a fair arrangement. The kind of arrangement that kept things calm. Frank Lucas listened to all of it without moving. When Galante finished, Lucas reached down, unclipped the leather satchel beside his chair, and placed it on the table. Inside, arranged in tight rubber-banded stacks, was $200,000 in cash. The room went quiet. Lucas looked at Galante directly for the first time all evening. He explained calmly that he had brought the money as a gesture of respect for the meeting. That he valued calm streets and peaceful operations as much as any man in the room. That he had no interest in conflict. But he also explained, with the same unhurried tone, that 30% of his operation would be more than any man at that table could calculate, and that the number he was prepared to offer instead was 5%. A courtesy fee. Not a tax. Not a tribute. A courtesy. 5 seconds of silence. Then Carmine Galante, who had once been described by federal prosecutors as the most dangerous man in the United States, stood up slowly, reached across the table, and with a single sweep of his arm knocked the leather satchel off the surface. $200,000 cascaded across the floor of the private dining room. Bills scattered under chairs, under the table, against the baseboards. The 6 soldiers didn't move. They didn't need to. The gesture had already spoken. Galante straightened his jacket. He told Frank Lucas that he had 48 hours to reconsider. That the number was 30% and it was not a starting point for negotiation. That men who confused courtesy with weakness had a way of running out of time in this city. He then sat back down, picked up his fork, and returned to his meal as if Lucas had already left the room. Frank Lucas looked at the money on the floor. He looked at the 6 men around the table. He looked at Galante's profile, the thick jaw, the deliberate chewing, the absolute certainty of a man who had never once been made to feel the cold that comes after power leaves a room. Then Frank Lucas bent down, picked up the leather satchel, left the money on the floor, and walked out. He didn't slam the door. He closed it gently. That detail, every man in that room would later remember. The gentleness of it. Outside, the November air hit him cold and immediate. He stood on the sidewalk for 30 seconds, not moving, just standing, just breathing. A cab rolled past. A woman walked her dog. The city moved around him the way the city always moved, indifferent, relentless, already forgetting the last moment before this one. Frank Lucas got in his car and drove north toward Harlem. He did not make a single phone call that night. What nobody at that table knew, what Carmine Galante in his absolute certainty had never thought to ask, was that Frank Lucas had known before he walked through the door that the meeting would end exactly the way it had. He had not brought the $200,000 as an opening offer. He had brought it as a test. He needed to know whether Galante was a man who could be reasoned with or a man who needed to be worked around. The satchel leaving the floor told him everything he needed. He had 48 hours, Galante had said. Frank Lucas intended to use every one of them. He arrived at his apartment on Edgecombe Avenue at 12:30 in the morning. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon, stood at the window looking out over the city, and spent the next 40 minutes doing the only thing that had ever truly separated him from every other man trying to survive in the same game. He thought. Not about revenge. Not about retaliation. Not about the particular satisfaction of making Carmine Galante understand what it felt like to be wrong. He thought about structure. He thought about the geography of the problem. He thought about which parts of Galante's world were load-bearing and which parts were decorative. By 2 in the morning, he had his answer. Carmine Galante's operation ran on 3 things. Supply, which he controlled through old-world connections in Sicily. Distribution, which relied on a network of family-owned businesses in the Bronx and Brooklyn. And most importantly, silence. The cooperative silence of law enforcement officers, local politicians, and union officials who had been receiving envelopes for years. Remove any one of those 3 pillars and the structure weakens. Remove 2 and it staggers. Remove the 3rd quietly, precisely, without anyone seeing your hands involved, and the entire thing comes down on its own. Frank Lucas made 4 phone calls before sunrise. The first was to a man named Roosevelt Davis, who had spent 11 years as a longshoreman before transitioning into a different kind of work. Roosevelt knew every shipping route, every manifest clerk, every dock supervisor between Red Hook and Port Newark. More importantly, Roosevelt knew which ones were being paid by Galante's people and which ones were simply afraid of them. There was a meaningful difference. The second call was to a woman named Dolores, who worked as a bookkeeper for 3 legitimate businesses in the Bronx, all of which had been laundering Galante family money for the better part of a decade. Dolores had been introduced to Frank Lucas 14 months earlier by a mutual acquaintance. In those 14 months, Frank Lucas had never asked her for anything. He had simply remembered her birthday, sent flowers when her mother passed, and made sure she knew that if she ever needed anything, she had a number she could call. That kind of patience is its own form of investment. The third call was to a federal narcotics agent named Gerald Monroe, who had been attempting to build a case against Galante's operation for 3 years without success. Lucas did not offer Monroe Frank Lucas. He offered Monroe something more valuable. He offered Monroe a name, a date, and a location. A transaction that would happen in 72 hours involving 2 of Galante's most senior distributors. He asked for nothing in return. He simply said, as if passing along weather, that Monroe might want to be in the neighborhood. The fourth call was the most important and the simplest. He called his cousin Tyrone in North Carolina and told him that Grandma needed to go visit Aunt Ruth for a few weeks. The code was old, established years ago for exactly this kind of moment. Tyrone understood without being told anything else. By 6 in the morning, Frank Lucas was asleep. The first 48 hours after the dinner at Rouse were quiet on the surface. Lucas went about his regular business. He collected from his lieutenants. He approved a new distribution arrangement in Washington Heights. He ate lunch at a diner on 145th Street with a man who ran numbers for him in the Bronx, making sure to be visible, unhurried, unconcerned. If Galante had people watching him, and he assumed Galante had people watching him, they would see a man who had either decided to pay the 30% or had decided that 48 hours was enough time to not worry. Neither reading was correct. Beneath the surface, the 4 calls from the previous night were doing their work. Roosevelt Davis spent the first day making quiet conversation with 3 dock supervisors he had known for years. He didn't threaten them. He didn't bribe them. He simply reminded each of them, in the way that old acquaintances discuss things, that the particular arrangement they had with certain Bronx-based employers had become recently visible to certain people who tended to make visibility very expensive. He left each conversation by mentioning casually that he knew of alternative arrangements that paid better and asked fewer questions. By the end of the day, 2 of the 3 had indicated they were open to further discussion. Dolores spent the first day doing nothing unusual at all. She went to work. She filed the same reports she always filed. She smiled at the same people she always smiled at. But that evening, she made copies of 4 months of financial records and placed them in an envelope that she left in a specific location that Frank Lucas had described to her on the phone. Gerald Monroe spent the first day arranging surveillance. And somewhere in a small house in North Carolina, Tyrone Johnson told his grandmother that she was going to visit Aunt Ruth for a few weeks. The 48th hour arrived on a Thursday morning, gray and cold, the kind of November day that smells like old newspaper and exhaust. Frank Lucas was already awake when his phone rang at 7:15. He let it ring 4 times before picking up. The voice on the other end was one of Galante's men, a mid-level soldier named Petrosino, who had the perpetual air of a man delivering news he would rather not be associated with. Petrosino informed Lucas that Don Galante was prepared to be flexible on the timeline, but not on the percentage. 30% remained the number. However, as a gesture of good faith, payment could begin with the following month's distribution rather than the current cycle. Don Galante was generous with men who demonstrated wisdom. Frank Lucas listened to all of it. Then he asked Petrosino a single question. He asked whether Don Galante had noticed anything unusual in the past 24 hours. Petrosino went quiet. Lucas thanked him for the call and hung up. What Petrosino had not said, and what Lucas already knew because Roosevelt Davis had called him the previous evening, was that 2 of Galante's most trusted dock supervisors had stopped answering their phones. What Dolores's envelope had contained was now in the hands of someone who knew precisely what to do with it. What Gerald Monroe's surveillance team had captured the night before was currently being reviewed by federal prosecutors in a downtown office. And what Carmine Galante would discover over the next 72 hours, piece by piece, with a particular sick feeling of a man watching water drain from a room he thought was sealed, was that 3 separate pillars of his operation had begun to shake simultaneously. Not collapse. Shake. That was the genius of it. Frank Lucas was not trying to destroy Carmine Galante. Destruction was loud, expensive, and invited retaliation. What he was engineering was doubt. The specific, corrosive, impossible to locate kind of doubt that spreads through an organization the way damp spreads through walls. You can't see it happening, but one morning you wake up and something that was solid is soft. By Friday evening, 2 of Galante's mid-level Bronx distributors had been picked up for questioning by federal agents. They were released within hours, nothing charged, but the pickup itself was a rupture. In Galante's world, federal contact of any kind, even innocent contact, even contact that led to nothing, was treated as contamination. The 2 men found that their calls went unreturned, that their names were no longer spoken in certain rooms, that the invisible machinery of trust that kept them employed had quietly, without announcement, stopped running in their direction. Saturday morning brought a different kind of news. One of Galante's legitimate business fronts in the Bronx, a dry-cleaning operation that had been processing certain cash flows for years, was contacted by its bank about an irregularity in its recent filings. Nothing formal. Not an audit. Just a letter. The kind of letter that arrives before the letter that matters. But Galante's accountant knew what it meant. Someone had been talking to someone. Galante began making calls of his own. He was methodical about it, as he always was. He went through his list of people, his suppliers, his distributors, his financial intermediaries, his law enforcement contacts. He asked careful questions. He listened to answers that were fractionally slower than they should have been, fractionally more apologetic, fractionally less certain. He made note of the fraction. By Saturday evening, he had not yet identified what was happening. But he had confirmed that something was happening. And in the arithmetic of a man like Galante, that was its own kind of answer. That was the moment Galante understood. Not everything. Not the full architecture of what Frank Lucas had constructed in 48 hours. But enough. He understood that the man who had sat across from him at dinner and listened quietly and left the money on the floor had not driven home in defeat. He had driven home to work. Sunday morning, Carmine Galante made a phone call. Not to Frank Lucas directly. Men like Galante did not make that kind of call themselves. He called through an intermediary, a retired judge in the Bronx who had spent 30 years facilitating conversations between parties who preferred not to appear in the same room. The message was simple and characteristically stripped of anything that could be held against the speaker. Don Galante was interested in revisiting the terms of last week's discussion. He was prepared to consider a different number. Perhaps something closer to what Mr. Lucas had originally proposed. Frank Lucas received the message at 11 on Sunday morning. He was eating breakfast. He finished it before he responded. His response, delivered back through the same retired judge, was equally simple. He was glad that Don Galante was open to further conversation. However, he felt it was important to be honest that the situation had evolved somewhat over the course of the weekend, and that the terms he had initially proposed might no longer fully reflect the current landscape. He would be happy to sit down and discuss what a new arrangement might look like. He suggested Monday. Neutral location. No soldiers. Galante agreed. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Both men were polite throughout. The number that emerged from that room was not 30%. It was not 5% either. It was an arrangement so advantageous to Frank Lucas that the men who heard about it in the weeks that followed struggled to reconcile it with the image of the same Carmine Galante who had swept $200,000 off a table 6 days earlier. What had changed? Nothing had been destroyed. No one had been hurt. No shots had been fired. No bodies had appeared. No explicit threat had ever been spoken aloud. What had changed was simply this. In 6 days, Frank Lucas had rearranged enough of the furniture in Galante's world that Galante could feel the draft. And a man who can feel a draft knows, even if he cannot see the open window, that the temperature is going to keep dropping. In the weeks that followed, the dock supervisors who had been quietly repositioned began working with Lucas's distribution network. The financial irregularity at the Bronx dry cleaning front resolved itself without consequence, the kind of resolution that requires the right people to say the right things to the right institutions. Gerald Monroe's surveillance operation produced enough material to keep certain conversations ongoing without ever quite reaching the stage of formal indictment, a condition that Monroe found professionally frustrating and that Frank Lucas found precisely calibrated. The two Galante distributors who had been briefly detained returned to their positions, cleared of any suspicion, welcomed back into the fold. No one would ever be able to prove they had been positioned as targets. No one could demonstrate that the call to Monroe had come from a specific phone. No one could trace the envelope Dolores had placed in a specific location back to any conversation that had ever occurred. Frank Lucas was nowhere in any of it. He was at a diner on 145th Street, or at a community meeting in Harlem, or driving himself to an appointment in a dark suit with no tie and shoes that cost more than most men in New York made in a month. The legend that emerged from those 6 days was told in fragments, in the way that the best stories always travel, through the people who had been in the room, and the people who had heard from people who had been in the room, and the people who had constructed their own versions from the available evidence and their own sense of what was possible. In some versions, Lucas had produced documents at the Monday meeting that made Galante pale. In others, he had said something in the meeting that no one else present could hear. In others still, the story began not with a dinner at Rouse but with a single phone call that Galante received on Saturday night, a call from someone he trusted absolutely, someone who told him something that changed the color of everything. What all the versions agreed on was the outcome. The man who had swept $200,000 off a table on a Tuesday night had, by the following Monday, agreed to an arrangement that represented a fundamental reordering of who held what in the city of New York. And somewhere in North Carolina, Grandma made her way back home from Aunt Ruth's, unpacked her bags, and called Frank to let him know she'd arrived safely. He told her he was glad. He told her everything was fine. He was right. For now, everything was. But Frank Lucas understood better than any man alive that fine was not a destination. It was a weather pattern. It held until it didn't. The city kept moving, the game kept moving, and the only men who survived long enough to matter were the ones who understood that every arrangement, no matter how favorable, was simply the setup for the next one. Carmine Galante would go on to face his own reckonings in the years that followed, from directions that had nothing to do with Frank Lucas. The federal machinery that had begun turning in those 6 days would grind slowly, the way federal machinery always grinds, toward conclusions that arrived long after the specific moments that had set them in motion. Frank Lucas would continue building, expanding, moving. Blue magic kept flowing. The streets kept choosing. And somewhere in the city's long memory, in the barbershops and the back rooms and the late-night conversations between men who had been watching since before either of these men existed, the story of those 48 hours settled into the particular category of legend reserved for moments when intelligence defeated arrogance so cleanly that the defeated party barely understood what had happened until it was already history. Carmine Galante, it was said, never again swept anything off a table in the presence of a man he hadn't fully studied. He had learned, at considerable cost and without a single drop of blood being spilled, that the man across the table who says less than you expect is not the man who knows less than you. He may be the man who already knows everything. He may have known it before he sat down. He may have walked through your door not to negotiate but to confirm what he had already decided, to take the measure of your reaction to a number, to read the way your hand moves when your certainty is challenged. He may have left your money on the floor not as a concession but as a gift designed to make you feel, for 48 hours, that you had won. Because a man who believes he has won stops watching the doors. That is what Frank Lucas understood that Carmine Galante did not. That in the game of power, the most dangerous move is the one your enemy doesn't recognize as a move at all. The money stayed on the floor of that private dining room at Rouse for 20 minutes after Lucas left. One of Galante's soldiers eventually picked it up. He counted it carefully, bundled it back into stacks, and placed it on the table in front of his boss. Galante looked at it for a long time. Then he told his soldier to put it away. He never mentioned it again. If you want to know what real power looks like, it doesn't always announce itself with weapons or soldiers or the theatrical performance of dominance that lesser men confuse for strength. Sometimes it looks like a man in a dark suit, no tie, closing a door gently on his way out of a room. Sometimes it looks like 48 hours of complete silence while the architecture of your enemy's world begins, slowly, invisibly, to shift. Sometimes it looks like a grandmother packing her bags for a trip to visit relatives, just until things settle. Frank Lucas knew something that the 5 boroughs spent years learning and the history books have never quite found the language for. He knew that the most complete victory is the one your opponent helps you build. Give a man enough certainty and he will dismantle his own defenses. Give him enough arrogance and he will hand you the tools. Give him 48 hours to feel like he has already won and he will do half your work for you. The table at Rouse where Galante had swept the money to the floor became, in the years that followed, a kind of landmark in the memory of the men who moved through that world. Not because of what had happened there, but because of what had been decided there. And what had been decided, though neither man had spoken it aloud, was simple. One of them had come to that table to deliver a message. The other had come to receive one. By the time the door closed, both men knew which was which. Only one of them had been right about which role he was playing. That is the story of the 48 hours. That is why Frank Lucas was not merely feared. He was studied.